Escorial, September 1598. The palace stood in mournful silence, its long corridors dimly lit by flickering candlelight and shrouded in a stillness that only suffering can summon. Behind thick stone walls, where once the footsteps of courtiers and the echoes of royal decrees resounded, there now lingered only the hushed whispers of anxious physicians and the occasional haunting groan that escaped from the royal bedchamber. Inside that room, once a place of imperial command, lay a man disfigured by torment, barely clinging to life. His body, once strong and authoritative, had been hollowed out by disease and time. His hands, gnarled and twisted from years of gout, resembled the bent claws of a dying beast. His legs, grotesquely swollen with edema, had not supported his weight in weeks. The flesh on his body, decaying while he yet breathed, released a stench so pungent, so foul, that even the most loyal of servants covered their faces when summoned to his side. And yet this was no nameless sufferer enduring the end of a hard-lived life. This was Philip II of Spain, the most powerful monarch of his era. Philip was not merely a king. He was a titan of his time, the ruler of Spain and Portugal, of Naples and Sicily, Duke of Milan, and master over the immeasurable territories of the New World. His empire stretched across the continents, vast enough that the sun never truly set upon it. He was the man who dared challenge Elizabeth I of England, the visionary who oversaw the construction of the Grand Escorial Palace, and the relentless leader who spearheaded the Catholic Church's fight against the rising tide of Protestant reform. He had commanded fleets, signed edicts that reshaped nations, and held sway over millions of souls. Yet here he was, dying slowly, inch by inch, surrounded not by the splendor of courtly tribute, but by the unbearable scent of his own decay. The most powerful king in the world, reduced to a pitiful, gasping shadow of what he once was. How could it come to this? How could a man who once ruled the known world with absolute authority meet such a grotesque and lonely end? To answer that, one must return to the very beginning, to the moment Philip entered the world. Born on May 21st, 1527, in the Spanish city of Valladolid, Philip was the only legitimate son of Emperor Charles V and Isabella of Portugal. From his earliest days, Philip's life was marked by responsibility, discipline, and a relentless preparation for the burdens of kingship. His father, Charles, was a man of action, an emperor of battlefields and diplomacy. But Philip was molded differently. While Charles rode into war, Philip buried himself in papers. He was not a warrior by nature, but an administrator, methodical, deeply pious, and obsessive in his need to control every detail of governance. He would become known as El Rey de los Papals, the king of papers, for his endless hours spent reading, annotating, and responding to state documents with unwavering precision. When Charles V abdicated in 1556, weary from decades of war and political pressure, it was Philip who stepped forward to assume the immense weight of the Spanish crown and the far-reaching empire that came with it. At the age of just 29, Philip found himself not only the king of Spain, but the heir to a global dominion stretching from the Americas to Asia. He inherited power on a scale few could comprehend, along with enemies at every frontier and the insatiable demands of an empire that never slept. But the story of Philip II is not just one of power. It is one of isolation, of obsession, of a man slowly consumed by the very structure he had built to maintain control. His reign would be defined by endless paperwork, ceaseless wars, and the pursuit of religious orthodoxy at all costs. And, ultimately, by a long and unspeakably painful decline, where his body decayed as mercilessly as his legacy was questioned. The grandeur of his empire could not shield him from the slow horror of death, and as his final days approached, he was left to face them not with triumph, but in agony. In the year 1580, the Iberian Peninsula stood on the edge of political transformation. The Portuguese succession crisis had plunged the kingdom into uncertainty after the sudden disappearance of King Sebastian at the Battle of Alcácer. With no direct heir to claim the throne, a power vacuum emerged, one that would soon be filled by Philip II of Spain. As the grandson of King Manuel I of Portugal, Philip believed his right to the Portuguese crown was legitimate and divinely ordained. Determined to enforce this claim, he mobilized an imposing Spanish army under the command of the seasoned Duke of Alba. The decisive confrontation came when Philip's forces defeated those loyal to Dom Antonio, the prior of Crato, who had styled himself king in opposition. With this victory, Philip was crowned Philip I of Portugal, uniting the crowns of Spain and Portugal. For the first time, two of the greatest empires on earth were brought under a single ruler, creating a global dominion that stretched across continents and oceans. Philip II was not merely a king by blood or conquest. He was a man who saw his monarchy as a divine mission. Deeply devout and uncompromising in his faith, he regarded himself as God's instrument on earth. His rule coincided with the height of the Counter-Reformation, and under his command, the Spanish Inquisition reached new levels of intensity. Heretics, infidels, and those deemed threats to Catholic orthodoxy were relentlessly pursued and punished. Yet this same man, whose name became synonymous with religious severity, was also a patron of refinement and culture. He surrounded himself with art, music, and architecture, shaping the intellectual and aesthetic character of his age. Nowhere was his dual nature more evident than in his most ambitious architectural undertaking, the monastery of San Lorenzo de El Escorial. Situated in the mountains northwest of Madrid, El Escorial was more than a palace. It was a sprawling complex that fused the functions of a royal residence, a monastery, and a royal mausoleum. It embodied Philip's vision of kingship, a ruler chosen by God, governing with both spiritual and temporal authority. His personal life, however, was marked by a string of tragedies and controversial decisions. Philip married 4 times, each union shaped by political strategy and the hope of producing heirs. His first wife, Maria Manuela of Portugal, died shortly after giving birth to their son, Prince Carlos. The prince would grow into a troubled and rebellious young man, eventually imprisoned by his own father on charges of treason and mental instability. He died in confinement under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind a legacy of whispered rumors and unanswered questions. Philip's second marriage, to Mary Tudor of England, infamously known as Bloody Mary, ended in sorrow as well. Though it was a union intended to strengthen Catholic influence in England, Mary died without bearing children, and her dream of a Catholic England died with her. Philip's third wife, Elizabeth of Valois, daughter of the French king, bore him 2 daughters before dying during childbirth. His final and perhaps most significant marriage was to Anna of Austria, his own niece. With her, Philip finally secured a male heir, the future Philip III, as well as several other children. Of the many born, only 5 would survive infancy, a harsh reminder of the era's fragile grasp on life. Though Philip ruled over a vast and powerful empire, his own body was in a constant state of decline. From an early age, he suffered from gout, a disease of the aristocracy, caused by excessive consumption of red meat and wine, which were staples of royal banquets. Gout, often called the disease of kings, inflicted him with excruciating joint pain that grew worse with age. By the time he reached his 60s, the affliction had become chronic. His joints, especially in his hands and feet, were deformed and inflamed, rendering him nearly immobile. As if this were not enough, he also began suffering from tertian fevers, likely a form of malaria that caused high fevers to spike every 3 days. Added to this was severe edema, an accumulation of fluids in his legs that caused grotesque swelling, disfigurement, and further limited his mobility. The once prudent king, known for his meticulous governance and boundless correspondence, found himself increasingly confined to his chambers. his body betraying the immense will that had once commanded empires. By 1596, the twilight of his life had descended in full. The man who had once governed the most expansive empire in the world could barely hold a pen. His gout-ravaged hands, once used to signing edicts that shaped the fate of nations, were no longer capable of performing even the simplest of tasks. For a monarch whose identity had been built upon his role as an administrator, someone who ruled not with flamboyant gestures but with precise control over every detail, this loss was more than physical. It was existential. His physical decay mirrored the inescapable truth of mortality, even for a man of almost divine authority. In his final years, he became a prisoner within his own flesh, trapped in a body that refused to obey him, surrounded by the trappings of majesty but denied its comfort. Philip II died on September 13, 1598, at the age of 71. His death marked the end of an era dominated by religious zeal, imperial ambition, and personal tragedy. He left behind a legacy as one of the most powerful monarchs in European history, a man who saw himself as God-chosen, whose empire spanned continents, yet who, in the end, was as vulnerable as any other to the slow, inevitable decline of the human body. By the summer of 1598, the once mighty Philip II of Spain, ruler of the most expansive empire in the world, had become a shadow of the man who had once commanded the fates of continents. His health had been in steady decline for years, but by July, the deterioration accelerated into a harrowing descent. The king was besieged by a host of illnesses, his body ravaged by gout, a condition that had tormented him for decades, now flaring in nearly every joint. His hands, feet, knees, elbows, and even his spine throbbed with agony. Movement was impossible. Fever surged through his body in relentless waves, likely the result of a chronic infection or malaria, and his physicians, desperate and helpless, resorted to the only tools available to them: bloodletting and purges. These medieval remedies, far from healing him, only weakened his already failing body. The king, once a meticulous and calculating ruler known for his iron will, now lay bedridden, trembling under the weight of his own suffering. As the days stretched into weeks, his condition grew worse. He could no longer rise from his bed. His flesh, unrelieved by movement, began to break down. Pressure ulcers, bed sores formed on his back, legs, and buttocks. These sores, left untreated and exposed to heat and moisture, quickly became infected, oozing pus and attracting flies. His mattress had to be cut open to allow the fluids to drain, an act more out of desperation than care. The room filled with the scent of decay. Still, his attendants were forbidden to move him too frequently, as the pain caused by even the slightest shift was excruciating. But it was not just disease that claimed his body. The king's decaying frame had become a haven for lice. The parasites thrived in his matted hair, beard, and beneath his garments, feeding off him as he lay helpless. This once proud monarch, whose word had shaped the policies of Europe and the colonies of the New World, could no longer even command control over the vermin that consumed him. And yet, through the veil of agony, Philip II maintained moments of terrifying clarity. Witnesses claimed that even as his body rotted, his mind remained sharp enough to perceive the cruel irony of his end. In one moment of lucidity, he reportedly turned to a confessor and murmured, "See how this body, which ruled half the world, now cannot rid itself of these little creatures." It was a tragic observation, half bitter jest, half spiritual reckoning, from a man who had once believed himself chosen by God to uphold the Catholic order on earth. Now, stripped of dignity, surrounded by suffering, he faced the ultimate humbling of the flesh. The grandeur of his empire, the riches of the Indies, the silver of the Americas, the vast naval fleets and colonial holdings meant nothing as he lay dying, swarmed by lice and drenched in sweat. Those who stood beside him during his final days described a harrowing scene. Priests prayed continuously by his bedside. The sound of whispered Latin filled the chamber as incense burned in an attempt to mask the stench. A crucifix was placed firmly in his hands, twisted now by gout, barely able to grasp the sacred wood. And yet he held on. To the very end, Philip viewed his agony not merely as physical suffering, but as divine punishment. He had ruled with absolute power, had overseen the brutal operations of the Inquisition, and had watched countless people die in the name of orthodoxy and empire. In these final moments, some believed he welcomed his suffering as a form of penance, a purgatory on earth to cleanse his soul before judgment. Clerics attending him claimed he bore his misery with a stoic, almost saintly patience, utterly convinced that each hour of torment brought him closer to salvation. As the weeks dragged into nearly 2 months, the body of the monarch continued to fail. His once powerful frame was emaciated. His voice, once firm and commanding, had become a faint whisper. His skin turned pale and blotched. And then, finally, on the morning of September 13th, 1598, after 52 days of unrelenting suffering, Philip II died. He passed away with a crucifix in hand, surrounded by clergy, nobles, and servants who had witnessed the terrifying majesty of a king's end. A stillness fell over the room. For a moment, those present saw a trace of peace return to his face, a strange, serene expression that had been absent for weeks. Perhaps it was the lifting of pain, or perhaps something deeper, something spiritual. His body was embalmed and prepared for burial, a difficult task given the advanced decay and the brutal toll of his illnesses. Nonetheless, he was laid to rest with all the ceremony befitting an emperor in the royal crypt of the Escorial Monastery, a massive structure he himself had commissioned. That monastery, part palace and part spiritual fortress, stood as a monument to his reign and his beliefs. Unyielding power, absolute faith, and an unshakable conviction in divine order. But the grandeur of the tomb could not conceal the truth of his end. Philip II, King of Spain, Portugal, Naples, Sicily, and ruler of an empire where the sun never set, died not in glory or triumph, but in darkness, disease, and torment. His death was not a heroic final chapter, but a slow, excruciating unraveling, a grim reminder that no matter how vast a man's power, he is still bound by the limits of his mortal flesh. And in the silence that followed his passing, the world saw, perhaps for the first time, not the king, but the man beneath the crown. The death of Philip II brought to a close one of the most complex and paradoxical reigns in European history. He was a king defined by his unwavering commitment to Catholicism and a relentless pursuit of centralized power. He launched the infamous Spanish Armada against Protestant England, crushed uprisings in the Netherlands with brutal determination, and oversaw the unification of Portugal and Spain under a single crown. His vision was imperial, his methods often ruthless, and his reach seemed limitless. From the cold palaces of Madrid to the distant colonies across the Atlantic, Philip sought to imprint his authority on every corner of his vast domain. His reign was marked by a suffocating level of control. Every document, decision, and directive passed through his hands. His bureaucratic machine was so meticulous that even the most minor details rarely escaped his attention. He was, in his own eyes and in the eyes of many, not merely a sovereign, but a chosen instrument of God, ordained to defend the true faith and impose divine order upon the world. Yet it is precisely this image of divine authority that makes the final chapter of his life so tragically ironic. The man who had spent his entire reign attempting to dominate every element of governance, religious, political, and military, found himself, in his last days, utterly powerless. Reduced to a shadow of his former self, Philip suffered from an array of debilitating illnesses that left him disfigured, immobile, and consumed by pain. His body, once viewed as the physical representation of the state itself, became a grotesque symbol of decay. Parasites infested his flesh, and his agonizing condition dragged on for months, if not years. Those who had once seen in him the strength of divine providence now looked on in horror as he was slowly devoured by disease. His demise was not quick, nor was it dignified. It was a drawn-out spectacle of suffering that profoundly disturbed those around him. Historians continue to examine how this prolonged deterioration may have shaped the political landscape of his final years. Some argue that his failing health forced him to depend increasingly on advisors, men who often lacked his sense of strategy and his obsessive attention to detail. As his physical strength faded, so too did the precision and control that had once defined Spanish policy. This dependency may have contributed to the growing number of military defeats and financial crises that began to plague the Spanish Empire toward the end of his rule. Others, however, suggest that his physical suffering humbled him, softening his notorious stubbornness and making him more open to negotiation and compromise. Evidence of this is seen in some of the peace treaties signed in the latter part of his reign, decisions that may reflect a man finally willing to let go of his iron grip in the face of mortality. Regardless of how it influenced policy, Philip's death had an undeniable symbolic impact. In the worldview of the time, the king's body was more than just flesh and blood. It was a sacred vessel, the earthly representation of divine authority. To witness the most powerful Catholic monarch of the age reduced to such a state was more than a personal tragedy. It was a theological crisis. If the man believed to be chosen by God could suffer so horribly, what did that mean for the divine order itself? Could it be that the suffering of kings was no different from that of ordinary men? Was power truly divine, or was it merely an illusion wrapped in rituals and symbols? The ascension of his son, Philip III, brought these questions into sharper focus. The new king inherited an empire still immense in size and influence, but one already showing signs of internal erosion. Unlike his father, Philip III lacked both the temperament and the interest to govern with the same intensity. Traumatized perhaps by the grim spectacle of his father's decline, he seemed more drawn to comfort and pleasure than to the burdens of rulership. Administrative control was quickly handed off to favorites and court insiders, chief among them the Duke of Lerma, whose political maneuverings would come to define the early years of the new reign. Where Philip II had micromanaged, his son delegated. Where the father had sacrificed personal well-being for imperial duty, the son appeared to retreat into the safety of leisure. In the end, the story of Philip II's death serves as a timeless reminder of the human condition. Here was a man who had ruled over an empire so vast that it was said the sun never set on it. He had shaped the course of nations, dictated the fate of millions, and walked through life with the authority of a monarch who believed he was ordained by heaven itself. Yet his final chapter was one of slow, humiliating collapse. The same man who had once commanded fleets and forged kingdoms died in agony, a prisoner in his own decaying body. His death is not just a grim historical anecdote. It is a memento mori, a chilling symbol that no crown, no empire, and no divine claim can shield one from the inevitability of death. Beneath the golden robes, beyond the marble palaces and jeweled scepters, Philip II was, like all of us, mortal. And in his death, we are reminded of a truth often obscured by the grandeur of power, that even the greatest rulers cannot escape the frailties of the flesh. His life may have been a testament to authority, but his death was a monument to vulnerability. And in that, there lies a lesson deeper than any royal decree, an eternal truth about the limits of human power.